Russiagate, the war in Syria, the alleged chemical weapons attack in 2018 in Douma. Listen to the mainstream and you'll hear one agreed narrative on all of them. Questioning that narrative can make you a target, which is something that independent journalist Aaron Maté knows all about. Last year, he won an Izzy award, which is kind of like an Oscar for independent journalists. And that was for his work on Russiagate. Aaron joins me now from New York. Aaron, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me. As I mentioned in my introduction, I kind of want to ask you about Russiagate straight away. I know that that's been the focus of a lot of your work, this idea that Donald Trump and the Kremlin were in cahoots during the 2016 election. You've called Russiagate reporting fan fiction, and for example, you actually retweeted this tweet by the White House reporter for CBS, Paula Reed, who said, noticing a sharp uptick in social media trolling from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. lately, many of the anti-mask disinformation comments on this tweet started at around the same time people in Moscow would be getting up. Can you take me through why you thought this tweet was somehow illustrative, perhaps, of the levels of psychosis in Western discourse right now?
I mean, there's a million to choose from. Russia has been blamed for racial unrest and injustice in the United States. It's been accused of having the capacity to freeze millions of Americans to death. This was by Rachel Maddow, the top-rated liberal cable news show host. You can go on and on and on. Russia has been blamed for everything, starting with the election of Donald J. Trump in 2016. And what this is a product of is a convergence of many factors, all of them sharing one underlying theme, which is that it exists to protect the power, privilege, and pride of the powerful. So take the Democratic Party, which has pushed Russiagate above all else since 2016. They lost to a clown in 2016, Donald Trump, a buffoon, who pretended to be a working class champion. And even though he was such a con artist, there was so much unhappiness and outrage at the Democrats for their failed neoliberal legacy that enough people in enough states were willing to vote for a con man who presented himself as being anti-establishment because they were that fed up with the Democrats. So the obvious lesson for Democrats from this would be to, after losing to a fake anti-establishment candidate, to become a genuine anti-establishment party. But the problem with that is that that would threaten their own power and privilege within the establishment. So instead, they needed an excuse to avoid becoming a genuine alternative to Trump. And Russia became the main vehicle for that. We know that from reporting inside the Clinton campaign. Literally, just hours after they lost, they decided on a strategy that they were going to blame, among many other things, Russia for their failure. And what we're seeing since 2016 is just a prolonged dramatization of that every single day, constantly. And that interest, that imperative, happens to converge with other powerful sectors, including the national security state, which was very upset that Donald Trump was posing, again, falsely, I think, but effectively, as an anti-war candidate. He talked about scaling back foreign interventions in Libya and Syria. He criticized the Iraq War. And he talked about having better relations with Russia, which was anathema to national security state officials whose existence is partly predicated on confrontation with states like Russia, because that justifies all the militarism and chauvinism that they strive on. And that also happens to justify a lot of lucrative weapons contracts that fund these people. So what you have here is a convergence of interests. And when you have such a powerful convergence, that's when you see all these desperate attempts to justify it, stooping to the point where people are willing to blame Russia for anything, you know, and everything is the work of Russian trolls and bots.
And Aaron, why are you so different then? Why does this story compel you so much?
Well, the short answer is I like to think it's because I have minimal integrity. And if you're a journalist, you're supposed to follow the facts. But look, even from a partisan perspective, which I am partisan. I'm a leftist, and I don't want to see Donald J. Trump handed gifts, and I don't want to see him reelected. My point about this from the start was that I can't think of a bigger gift to Trump and the Republicans for all the awful things that they've done, for Trump's resistance to instead focus on a stupid conspiracy theory and to blame, Russian Facebook ads and allegedly stolen emails for their loss. I mean, it's made Trump's resistance look ridiculous. And it's been a huge gift to Trump because while everybody was talking about Robert Mueller and while liberals were protesting to save the job of Jeff Sessions or Rod Rosenstein, our eye got distracted from all the awful things that Trump is doing. So, Trump tore up the Iran nuclear deal. He attacked healthcare. He escalated the draconian treatment of immigrants in the U.S. All these awful things, but yet the Trump-Russia issue was outshadowed all of those. And, I mentioned the protest for Jeff Sessions. Literally, there were bigger protests among liberals in the U.S. to save Jeff Sessions' job than there were to save the Iran nuclear deal or the Paris Climate Accords, both of which Trump tore up. Or, by the way, to save the INF Treaty, a critical nuclear treaty with Russia that Trump also destroyed. So one consequence of Russiagate has been to hand Trump massive gifts by distracting his opposition. It then gave him the additional gift when he was exonerated in the Trump-Russia investigation by Robert Mueller. And now there's another gift as, the election is in full swing. We're getting more revelations about all the fraud that it took to perpetuate the Trump-Russia investigation by the national security state officials. So I think this thing has been a gift to Trump if you view this strictly from a partisan narrative. And it's also been a threat to the world because Democrats and liberals have been so beholden to this narrative, this idea that Trump does Russia's bidding. They've then ignored consciously all the dangerous policies that Trump has actually pursued towards Russia. I mentioned one of them, tearing up the INF Treaty. He's currently threatening the last remaining nuclear treaty between the U.S. and Russia that limits the nuclear stockpiles of both countries, the New START Treaty. Trump is threatening to kill it. It expires in February. Nobody talks about it. Why not? Because even though literally this is an issue of nuclear peril, it undercuts the convenient narrative that liberals have used to soothe themselves since 2016, which is that Trump is in Putin's pocket. So look, I could go on forever about why this has been so dangerous. And on the left, it's made, being a leftist or a liberal synonymous with this sort of anti-Russia chauvinism and Cold War hawkishness. That's not the left to me.
Do you think a Biden win will make this whole Russiagate shit go away?
No. The Biden camp is full of Cold War hawks with many of the same policies as people in the Trump circle. I just think that the prospects of pushing the Biden camp in a less destructive direction are much higher than in the Trump camp, which is filled with just sociopaths, I think, who are bent on regime change in Iran and Venezuela. And the Biden administration, I think, will try many similar policies, but there's a chance at least that there's enough organized pressure, organized grassroots mobilization to steer U.S. policy on a better path. And at home, I think you have a Biden administration that will be much less greedy and hostile towards the domestic population than the Trump camp. But in terms of Russia, yeah, look, it's the Biden camp. They come from the wing that has foisted Russiagate on the world, and they will continue it. All that said, though, Biden has said that he would rejoin New START, the nuclear treaty with Russia that Trump is trying to kill. And Vladimir Putin has even said recently that has noted that, and he seemed to suggest that he actually prefers a Biden win accordingly. I wouldn't blame him because Biden, I think, is far more rational when it comes to these existential issues like nuclear weapons than Trump is, who's trying to destroy nuclear weapons arms control deals. So I think Biden will continue many of the same things, but there's a chance, I think, of it trying to mitigate some of the damage and pushing U.S. policy in a less destructive course.
Do you think he'll win? Because obviously the polls at the moment suggest that he will, but of course the polls have been so wrong in the past.
I think Trump has been so awful, and his handling of the pandemic, culminating in him catching the virus himself, I think will be very damaging to him. But, you know, as you said, the polls were wrong in 2016. I thought no way in 2016 that Trump would win. So who knows? You know, I can't predict, but I would be certainly very surprised if Trump manages to pull this off again.
So I'm going to move you on to Syria now. I know in particular you've been doing a lot of work on the alleged 2018 Douma chemical weapons attack and the fact that whistleblowers from the OPCW say they found evidence that contradicts the Western narrative that it was carried out by Assad, and these whistleblowers say that these findings of theirs have been suppressed. Can you just give me a lowdown of that story for any of our viewers who may not have heard of it, which is highly likely?
Well, many people likely have not heard of it because, to me, it is the most censored news story of the last year. It's unbelievable. You have the most serious action that a country can take, which is bombing another country. In April 2018, the U.S., Britain, France bombed Syria based on allegations that the Syrian government committed a chemical weapons attack in the town of Douma that same month. A year later, the OPCW, the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, puts out a report purporting to come from the investigation that it sent into Douma on the ground shortly after the U.S. and its allies bombed Syria. And that report basically backed up the U.S. narrative. It said that there were reasonable grounds to believe that a chemical attack occurred in Douma and that the weapon was likely molecular chlorine or contained molecular chlorine. And the inference of the report was that the culprit was the Syrian government because the Syrian government was the only warring party with aircraft. Then we started getting a series of leaks showing that what the OPCW told the world is the exact opposite of what its own investigators who went to Douma found. And they found serious evidence that the attack was staged by militants on the ground, which, even if you don't even look at any of the evidence, it makes perfect sense because the idea that the Syrian government used chemical weapons in Douma was so illogical. It was about to retake Douma from this extremist militant called Jaish al-Islam, which is financed by Saudi Arabia. And this chemical weapons allegation attack would have meant, if the Syrian government did it, it would have meant that the Syrian government, right as it's about to retake this town, where militants have been shelling, by the way, relentlessly Damascus, right as they're about to do that, they decide consciously to do the one thing that they know will trigger U.S. military intervention because Trump has said and did the year before that he would enforce the so-called red line, that if Syria uses chemical attacks, he will bomb Syria. Syria was accused of another chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun literally the year before, and Trump bombed Syria. Now, there are also a whole bunch of problems with that allegation too. But the Douma case is one where we have now clear-cut evidence. It's unequivocal because we have the actual OPCW investigators who went there. And they found all this evidence undermining the allegation. And what leaks from the OPCW also showed is that the report that the OPCW investigators wrote was taken by people above them, doctored, all the damning findings that pointed to the attack being staged were removed, and new conclusions that pointed to the Syrian government were added, which were completely unsupported by the evidence they collected. And key people who investigated in Douma in Syria were taken off of the report. They were kicked out. And by the way, all this happened under U.S. government pressure because the leaks also showed that the U.S. government, a delegation from the U.S., visited the OPCW, which is unprecedented, by the way. This doesn't happen. And basically told the investigators what to say, told them to say that this was a chlorine attack for obvious reasons, because they wanted this to justify their bombing. So this is extraordinary. It's basically the Iraq WMD story, you know, a phony case to go to war, except with whistleblowers, people on the inside. But look at the Western media. There's been virtual silence across the spectrum. I can't even get, you know, Democracy Now!, a very prominent leftist outlet where I used to work for 10 years. They haven't even covered this story.
Why not? Why haven't, you know, even outlets that you used to work at, why aren't they covering it?
Because so many people have been duped by the propaganda around the proxy war. And Russiagate fits into this, where any narrative that challenges sort of Cold War orthodoxy and the imperatives of the national security state, it gets dismissed as Russian disinformation. This proxy war cost billions of dollars. The CIA had a budget of this of close to $1 billion a year, if you believe the Washington Post, along with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, all these countries that were flooding Syria with weapons and fighters to fight this proxy war. And when you do that, you need a propaganda operation. In fact, leaks from the British government recently confirmed this or underscored this.
I was just about to lead into that because this story kind of blew my mind. I was listening to your podcast and I couldn't believe that I hadn't heard about these leaks from anywhere else. The extent of the UK-led propaganda campaign in Syria.
If you're engaging in a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar proxy war, and the beneficiaries of your proxy war are not the Syrians who went out to protest in 2011, because of course there were protests in 2011. Syria is run by an authoritarian government. It's a police state. So there were protests in 2011 calling for reforms. But that is not who the U.S. and its allies have been arming and funding for the last decade. Peaceful protests don't fight proxy wars, and they don't peaceful protesters don't fight proxy wars, and they don't chop the heads off of people who are of a different sect than them. But that's who we have been arming and supporting during the Syria proxy war. So for any war, you need an information warfare component as well. And that's where the UK has come in. And that's what these leaks from the British Foreign Office have exposed as a massive propaganda operation. Ben Norton, my colleague, says that this is the biggest actual propaganda operation in history, probably, to flood the public with propaganda, only showing suffering on one side, not showing the suffering committed by the militants funded by Britain, the U.S., and their allies, whitewashing the jihadists in Syria as so-called rebels and freedom fighters, when really it's a collection of Salafi jihadists, or at least that's who dominates the so-called rebels, and bombarding the Western public with propaganda. So it's an outrage, and yet the reason, and there's even evidence in there that this operation, fed journalists in the West stories and used the West to push their own propaganda. So of course, the Western media that's been used by all this and has been a willing participant is not going to talk about something that makes them, or exposes them as essentially arms of the state.
So on a slightly different note, Aaron, I was going to ask you, who do you think Novichoked Alexey Navalny? Do you believe the official story?
Well, I think the official story makes no sense. First of all, I don't know any Russian journalist, even those who are very critical of Vladimir Putin, who believe that Putin would have ordered this. It's become this propaganda thing that Putin poisons everybody he doesn't like. When you look at every single case and you have no reason to believe the allegations. It wouldn't, I know that Navalny polls at like 2 to 5%, 5% at the most. So, and in fact, it's actually convenient, I think, in some ways for Putin to have and has his opposition because Navalny is also a xenophobe and is not that popular in Russia. So,
his popularity can't really be measured in the terms of the Russian state or the way that any polling system would measure it, if you know what I mean. So I think he is a big figure. He really is. Okay. But the metrics that are used don't really reflect that. It would be my interjection there, I think.
Fair enough. So I stand corrected there. But certainly, I just don't see the motive that Putin would have to do this, especially when you look at, again, it's the same thing as Douma. In Douma, you have Syria accused of doing the one thing that would cause it serious damage, which is do something that would trigger U.S. military intervention. Then you have Putin accused of poisoning Navalny right as Putin is trying to complete this German-Russia gas pipeline, Nord Stream 2, which a lot of Cold War hawks want to stop, including Donald J. Trump, who has imposed sanctions in an effort to stop it, which has been successful. And by the way, that's one more aspect of Trump's policies that gets ignored because it undermines the convenient Russiagate narrative that he does Putin's bidding. So you have no motive, and you have every motive of people who want to poison Russia-Western relations to poison Navalny. And even the story where they found the Novichok on a water bottle in his hotel room but yet somehow that didn't contaminate anybody else. There's just a lot of questions with the story. The fact that also Russia keeps getting accused of these poisonings, and it gets accused of being this criminal mastermind, but yet it never manages to kill the people who it supposedly wants to poison. So the Skripals in London and now Navalny, whereas Novichok is a really deadly agent. So you're saying that Russia gave just the amount that gets the guy sick, causes an international outcry, but doesn't kill him? It just doesn't make any sense. And so I don't claim to know who did it or what the facts are, but I just certainly think that the allegation against the Kremlin is sketchy, to say the least.
Aaron, you're so nice to Russia. Like, comparatively speaking, why are you so nice to Russia?
You know, I've never been to Russia. My only real tie to Russia is that my father grew up in Soviet-occupied Hungary. And when he was a kid, he had to, in school they were told to worship Joseph Stalin.
That normally makes you hate Russia. You know, generations of kids of many immigrants will then not be fans of Russia in that case, quite often.
Yeah, well, it's not about hate. It's certainly my family's experience under the Soviet Union wasn't. There's not a lot of fondness for the Soviet era. Mm-hmm. But I also I just like facts, and I don't like warmongering. And if you look at the role Russia plays now, all these fact-free allegations that are used to justify warmongering, I feel a strong duty to challenge them. And I feel, especially as a leftist, where it's become fashionable on the left to become a cold warrior. And that's just not the left I want to be a part of. I want nuclear treaties with the U.S. and Russia. I want cooperation. I don't want to have a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine. I don't think the U.S. has any business on Russia's borders and expanding NATO all the way to Russia. It benefits weapons manufacturers, but I'm not sure who else it benefits. It benefits the egos of people who define themselves by supremacy, by being a global hegemon, a global empire. But I'm not interested in that. I'd like to have peace. So,
I was just going to say, your views there, like everything you're saying, it aligns so neatly with kind of the Kremlin opinion on everything. Do you see why some people are so keen to, discredit you as some sort of Kremlin mouthpiece in this case? And also, are you at risk of looking at Russia from an ideological angle and then, and then missing certain things just because you're looking at it through a particular prism already?
I don't know much about the Kremlin viewpoint beyond their policies on certain issues on Syria and on nuclear treaties. For example, they've called for renewing New START, and they've denied a lot of allegations against them. But that's not a viewpoint. That's just a assertion on facts or not. It's not ideology. In terms of the Kremlin's own internal viewpoint, I know that Russia has a corrupt system that is run by oligarchs, a system, by the way, that was imposed by the U.S. under Bill Clinton, which helped give Russia the system that it has today, which I think has been very destructive for Russia's people. And that's why during the Yeltsin years, it was a horrible time for Russia. And I think the U.S. has a major role in that. I know that Vladimir Putin has some right-wing views on social issues, but, I don't share those views, but I don't see what business they are of mine. I don't live in Russia. I don't live I don't like to weigh in on policies of governments where I'm not a citizen, where I don't live, and that have no direct impact on me. I'm concerned with the policies of my own government. I'm especially concerned when those policies affect people in other countries who have just as much the right to decide their own fate as people here in the U.S. without interference. So people want to accuse me of having viewpoints that align with the Kremlin. That's fine. What I care about is whether or not what I'm saying is correct and whether it's factual. And if I make an error, I'm happy to correct it. And if I have an argument that is being challenged, I'm happy to argue it. But I'm not going to be intimidated by people who just try to silence me by accusing me of being a Kremlin mouthpiece. To me, intellectually, it's no different than a kid calling some other kid a name. It's not serious.